the Anglo-Saxons paid them in tons of silver not to come back. Of course, they always did come back. But the Irish...
How do you spell that word?
D-A-N-E-G-E-L-D.
Okay.
Literally Danish gold, Dan money. But they pay it, it's bribery.
Uh-huh.
And all these guys, Jim Wilson, Red Hand Commando, Winky Irvin, the UVF, Jackie MacDonald, UDA, they are all salaried by the British and Irish governments. The Irish government operates through this strange organisation called Cooperation North, which has got several former chief constables, the chief executive assistant chief constable Peter Sheridan, former permanent secretaries, the great and the good, and some bleeding hearts. And they give the unionist paramilitary organisations through the front of community groups like Charter NI, Reach. They give them tens of thousands. So if their violence broke out, these guys would be out of business. They wouldn't be able to employ any of their supporters in loyalist districts, which is what they do all the time. They control the money that flows into loyalist districts. It's an absolute scandal. But there it is. And mind you, it has to be said, Sinn Féin pay their supporters through the Social Investment Fund, which is a lot more money than Cooperation North. Social Investment Fund, which the SDLP calls a slush fund, is in excess of 100 million a year.
Funded paid to who?
Sorry?
Who's the 100 million a year paid to?
It's called the Social Investment Fund, as controlled by Sinn Féin and the DUP. They look after their own people through this. There have been attempts in court to prevent the money being given to loyalist front organisations, but they've all failed. So loyalist front organisations are the recipients of tens of thousands of pounds from the British and Irish governments to behave themselves. So there's too much to lose if loyalists get involved in this kind of violence. But they don't have the capacity. They don't have the equipment. They don't have an armed militia. They don't own the police. It's not going to happen. And furthermore, the British Army is not going to come in here. If there were a referendum and it was for Irish unity, the British Army is not going to come in here. The British government is not going to send them to defend a place which has voted to join an All-Ireland Republic. If you had the British Army doing that, they'd be defying a democratic decision.
So, going back to the protocol, it seems to, at the moment, to have soured relations between the Irish and British governments, soured relations between the Irish government and unionists. Is this a problem going forward in the sense that in these disputes, Ireland, as a member of the EU, is more or less obliged to take the EU side, since the EU side came so heavily down on its side over the border and over Northern Ireland in particular, and there would be this strain in relationships with the Brits that didn't exist beforehand. And that kind of prevents them gets in the way doing the kind of cooperation that would be needed between them to prepare for a border poll.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of my great concerns. Relations are extremely bad between the British government and the Irish government, and have been since really 2017, getting further and further apart. I mean, excuse me, the Irish government, for example, had real difficulty. They were trying to maintain these relations, and they were asking for meetings of the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, which the British wouldn't agree to. They just didn't do it. And it would have been an ideal place for them to discuss the negotiations that were going on. But eventually they got a meeting in 2018. And at the end of it, first of all, Theresa May didn't turn up. At the end of it, they wouldn't give the Irish delegation a room to hold a press conference in, and they had to hold it on the lawn outside Westminster. So relations have got even worse since then. And as you say, quite correctly, Ireland has to stick with the EU as a member. So they will be supporting the EU. For example, when the EU takes legal action against Britain for extending the grace period unilaterally, the Irish government will support the EU's case against the British government. So as you say, this makes it extremely difficult to try to work out an agreed procedure for having a referendum or for the terms of a referendum, all that kind of stuff. It makes it, in the foreseeable future, relations are simply going to stay really bad.
So if you're looking at the fact that a Secretary of State can call a referendum when he thinks it's likely that there's a majority for unity, but if he were to call a poll, people would have to know what's on what's on offer. But everyone I've talked to agrees that has to be worked out in detail beforehand, so people are very clear exactly what they're getting, and that would frame the question on the referendum, and that it would be the Irish government's responsibility as the sovereign power to prepare that.
Yeah.
But does that not mean that in a certain case the Secretary of State would only call a poll when that would be a cooperative thing? That the Irish government would say, hold on, we're not ready yet. We haven't framed the question. We haven't finished our getting input from all sides. We're looking for consensus among political parties in our own jurisdiction. So that it would be a joint endeavour, not the Secretary of State kind of ringing up Dublin and saying, hi, I'm going to call a border poll.
Next Tuesday, yeah.
And this goes back to your previous point. This becomes more difficult now. Does it not?
Yes, it does. I mean, I put with some other people who put a lot of thought into this. And it's essential that there is detailed planning. As for example, with the Scottish referendum in 2014, they produced a book over 600 pages long, answering all the questions about, powers, about taxation, everything that has to be done. People have to know. I mean, this is obvious. People have to know what Irish unity means. What are they voting for? Is it a unitary state, a federal state, a confederal state? Does the Northern Assembly still remain afterwards? What about the health service? What about education? What about police? All that has to be considered and dealt with. And the referendum, there has to be a concurrent referendums, north and south. That's in the agreement. So the Irish government has to know in detail what the consequences are. Do they have to alter the constitution? Does there have to be a referendum to alter the constitution? Let me give you a specific example. Suppose it were to be a unitary state and the Stormont Assembly still survives. There wouldn't need to be a constitutional referendum because Article 15 of Bunreacht na hÉireann accepts subordinate legislation. Subordinate assemblies are legislatures. John Redmond originally proposed that as a way around the Home Rule crisis. But all those things have to be done, and because there are terribly bad relations at the moment, there doesn't seem to be any prospect of that kind of thing happening. We also don't know the criteria that the Secretary of State would use. Is it an assembly election with a majority in favour of opposing Brexit or going back into Europe? Is it a number of opinion polls? Is it a combination of both? We just don't know. And the Secretary of State won't say.
What kind of metrics would